Joining me, everyone, Charles Moscowitz here. Welcome to the program. And my guest, emanating from the state of Israel, is Professor Eyal Zisser. He is with the Tel Aviv University. He's a longtime professor there. He's the vice rector of Tel Aviv University. Thank you so much for joining me, Eyal.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Now, Eyal, first, before we get into issues, I want to ask you about your opinion on the present coalition government as it was sworn in, with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Benny Gantz as vice premier. How is that? How do you predict that's going to work out?
Well, we had a very unique experience, 3 election campaigns in less than 1 year. It was impossible. It was time to form a government, and then the coronavirus crisis, and followed by the economic crisis. So I think it was time to form a government. Of course, it's not the ideal government. Of course, not everybody is happy about the government. But I mean, when you look at the alternative, there was no real alternative rather than to go to the 4th election campaign, and then the 5th and the 6th, and so I think that's what Israel needs right now, political stability, and this government will provide us with such a political stability, at least in the short run, at least for the next several months, years, and that's what we need.
Right, and I think it's been done before in Israel. There was a national unity government with Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres. I believe each of them served a 1.5-year term, and they shared a 4-year term, or 2 years each, if I'm not mistaken, and I think it worked out okay.
Yes, and indeed it was essentially in solving the economic problems of that era, of the mid-80s. It took many courageous decisions. Of course, when we come to the peace process, when we come to the negotiations with the Palestinians, with other Arab countries, here I don't expect anything from this government, because the stalemate, because the lack of any consensus between the 2 major camps here. But anyhow, I don't think that even if there was a left-wing coalition, we could move ahead with the peace process. So I guess the Israeli society and Israel as a country has other priority rather than the issue of peace. It's important, but as I mentioned before, achieving political stability, easing the tension within the Israeli society, overcoming the economic challenge, Iran, and other issues. So probably it will have to wait.
Now, recently, Secretary of State Pompeo had a lightning-fast visit to Israel. Rumors have it, from what I've been hearing, at least some of my Palestinian sources have said that he pressured the Israeli government to not annex portions of the West Bank, which would be part of the Trump peace plan, and I think it's a very moderate peace plan, and that he particularly asked Gantz to sort of step up and use his authority to slow that process down. What can you say about that? Do you know anything about what's going on with that process?
Well, first of all, I think that Pompeo's visit had to do also with Iran and as well with China, because he made some important statements regarding Israel's relations with China. Incidentally, the Chinese ambassador to Israel, the late Chinese ambassador to Israel, passed away only several days after, and some, media reports in the United States and elsewhere link somehow, Well, it was a tragic event, no doubt about it. But coming back to the point you made, well, the whole issue of annexation, I think it had to do with the election campaigns we experienced in Israel. Netanyahu, well, is right wing. He has its own ideology. I think he is pragmatist, but he's not opportunist. He had his ideology. He wants to annex, but at the same time, he is very careful. He was always very careful. Clearly, when it came to Israeli-American relations. So I think that he was facing election. President Trump faced election, and here came, the outcome that you may speak about annexation. It will help you with some of your constituency, but I doubt it very much whether Netanyahu himself, regardless of guns, will do something about it, because it will be without American approval, without having any sort of dialogue with the Arab world. It will be dangerous. It might
certainly the case. However, the Trump plan, and I think that President Trump is very popular in Israel, and the plan that was put forth, I believe, a few months back by Jared Kushner and others, basically does give a green light to the annexation of certain portions of the West Bank, particularly the Jordan Valley and other areas that are not populated at all by Palestinians, and at the same time, it offers a corridor of sorts between the West Bank and Gaza, and a capital for the Palestinian nascent state in Jerusalem, in a certain neighborhood in Jerusalem. So, I would think that is as good a plan as. What do I know? I'm here in Boston, so I don't mean but. But, it seems to me to be as good a plan as any that the Palestinian Arabs could hope for. I doubt if they're going to go for it, but, given the history and given the fact that at this point there's something like 350 to 400,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria, you can't turn that clock backward. It seems to me to be a pretty rational plan, and they will be able to salvage, sovereignty in the areas on which they are the majority.
Yes, I fully agree. I think it's a positive step forward. It's a good plan in the sense that, in the past, American administration used to come to the Palestinian with some plans, some ideas, and all those plans were rejected. And actually, the Palestinians were given a veto right over any plan. And here comes Trump and say, you don't want to accept it, I will go with it without you. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that, when we come to the Israeli right wing, its position is quite complicated. The right wing, and well, as I said before, Netanyahu is part of the right wing, but is more moderate, more flexible. But the right wing says, if the Trump plan is, as you have just said, has to do with two major elements. First of all, the annexation, but at the same time, the Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state. I mean, the two-state solution. Right. The annexation is part of the bigger plan. And here comes the right wing and says, no, we'll only annex. The other issue we totally reject. We don't want a Palestinian state to be established in Judea and Samaria. We totally reject it, but we'll take from the Trump plan what is good for us, what we can live with, and this is the part of annexation. I don't think that this was what President Trump had to do, had in mind.
Not at all.
When he offered the plan. But that's how the right wing want to play with it, and I think also Netanyahu does understand that he can't come just like that and say, I'll annex. He will have to say something more clear about his position regarding the future Palestinian state, and I guess that this is why, he was elected, he is now the prime minister. He doesn't need it right now So I guess he will say to his followers, we need to consult with the American, we need to lay the ground, and in a year or two, come back to me. I don't think that it will be on the Israeli agenda in the short term.
That would make sense, and certainly it sounds like the Israeli right, in a way, is about the same as the Palestinian right, or in that they reject any peace plan at all, and they reject the state of Israel itself. So, those two sides are the extreme side, and I think that the Trump plan actually is very moderate in that, yes, it does recognize both a Palestinian state, but also it gives Israel the kind of borders that it would need to have security and to make sure that any such state would be reined in the future, and there's every reason to think that that could be a problem. Now, what about the northern border at this point and Hezbollah? It seems to me that Israel has pretty openly been engaging in an outright war against Hezbollah in Syria. They're attacking targets. I saw an article a week or two ago indicating that Hezbollah at this point is pulling up their stakes and they're going home to Iran. That their power in Syria has been, I wouldn't say broken, but certainly compromised. What, as the Israelis like to say, is going on the ground?
Well, there is. It's not cover. It's very public. This campaign. At the beginning, people tend to ignore or deny, but now everybody speak about it quite publicly. I mean, the Israeli campaign had. We can speak here about two stages. The first stage was to stop the Iranian effort to establish itself. I mean, we know there are Iranian soldiers in Syria that were sent by the Iranian to help President Bashar al-Assad in his struggle with the rebels in Syria. But then the Iranians tried to turn Syria into an advanced Iranian outpost. I mean, to build airports, to deploy their advanced missile systems, air defense system, even deploy aircraft. And this was unacceptable by Israel. And I mean,
of course,
the Israeli campaign was first of all aimed at stopping, the Iranian effort to establish itself in Syria and to turn it into an outpost. But now we come to the second phase, and the second phase is to get Iranian totally out of Syria. This, I believe, might be more complicated. I mean, Bashar is still in need for the Iranian soldiers. It's much more easier to monitor and to discover that there is a new airfield, that there is a new weaponry systems. It's much harder to find that there are, 50 Iranian soldiers here, 50 Iranian soldiers there. So it will be more complicated. And Iran invested billions of dollars in the Syrian project, shed its blood, thousands of Iranian soldiers. So I don't think that just like that, only because several Israeli attacks, Iran will give up. It will be a long battle. Iran now is facing severe crisis, economic crisis because of the American sanctions, also the Corona crisis. There was a major setback caused by the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. He was the mastermind behind, the Iranian effort to establish itself in the entire Middle East. But I mean, I guess the Iranian will try to go on with their project.
Do you think that the sanctions, excuse me, against Iran, plus the street sentiment in Iran, might lead to a relatively peaceable regime change there?
Yes, but the question is how long this will take. clearly not weeks or months, years. 3 years, 5 years, 20 years, I don't know. A change will come in our time life. This is the lesson we draw from the Iranian history during, let's say, the last decade, but the last century. But when, well, with historical processes, it's very hard to give, exact focus. There is a
Right.
need for change. The Iranian people want to change, but it can take time.
It's sort of analogous, I suppose, in a broad sense, to the Cold War against the Soviet Union. You
Yeah.
know, there was the containment policy, which eventually was really ramped up by Reagan. That Reagan was clear to identify the superior American system versus the authoritarian system of the Soviets, and that message got to the Soviet people, and they eventually took action. So I hope that can happen here. I know that there's been great and actually quite astonishing improvement in Israel's relations with many Arab countries, particularly the Gulf states, even Saudi Arabia, where you have cooperative efforts. I even think during the pandemic, there's been Israeli doctors who have been consulted about how to deal with it in places like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. So, I think that, in a way, there's progress being made. I mean, who knows? I mean, it can turn overnight. I get that. I mean, for a long time, Turkey was a relatively benign force. Now it's anti-Israel, so you can never tell. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I was just talking about the improvement of Israel's position in the periphery. Some of the Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, Oman, recently invited, and I think an Israeli ambassador to visit. These are improvements. Even Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, how is that going? Is this going to be a long-term development for Israel, or could that be all set back? And if so, how?
Well, what we witness is a major improvement in Israeli relations with all Arab countries. I mean, with Egypt, according to media reports, Israeli and Egyptian soldiers are fighting against ISIS in Sinai, not anymore with each other, but together. Israel is providing intelligence, and Israel is providing aircraft that are attacking ISIS targets in Sinai. Prime Minister Netanyahu met the other day with the Sudanese, well, it's not the president, but he's the chairperson of the military council that is ruling Sudan right now for the first time. And you mentioned the good relation between the Gulf states and Israel. Well, it has to do with the fact that, well, everybody says, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So the Arabs are worried about Iran. They feel threatened by the Iranians. They don't like the Turks, clearly Egypt or Saudi Arabia. The Palestinian question is not as important as it was, and Israel is not anymore a marginal player in the region. It's one of the strongest regional power, economically, militarily. So the result is much more readiness to cooperate. Yes, it's cooperation or covered alliance. It's not yet public. There will be always the Palestinian issue that will cast its shadow. But, speaking about point of no return, I think we cross it, yes. I mean, it's not that we might not see in the future some setback, but still, I'm very optimistic about Arab-Israeli relations in the coming years. Of course, solving the Palestinian problem or addressing the Palestinian problem will enable us to form a real alliance, to improve relations, to form diplomatic relations. but for the time being, there are intimate contacts between Israel and those states, and I guess it will continue.
That's good to know. And I mean, certainly, I don't know if Israel can expect friendly relations, but let's hope it's at least normal relations. You know, like in a way what Israel has with Egypt. It's
Yeah,
not a warlike posture. Okay, so my
yeah.
guest is Professor Eyal Zisser. He is with Tel Aviv University. He's coming to us from Tel Aviv. Uh, Eyal, I want to ask you a question about Tel Aviv University. Does the college have Palestinian students?
Uh, yes, we have something like in between 12 to 14% Palestinian students out of the total of 30,000 students. So 12 to 14% are, well, when you say Palestinians, we have to distinguish between local Israeli Arabs. I mean,
Right.
Arab, they are part of the Palestinian people, but they are Israeli citizens. And then we have Palestinians in Gaza and Judea and Samaria under Israeli rule or under the Palestinian Authority. We have, but the number is not as big because they have their own universities, and we teach in Hebrew, and they don't study Hebrew in high school, so it's much more problematic for them. But there are some, not only local Arab Israeli, but students, but also Palestinian students, and Arab and Turkish students as well.
Sure. And probably international students as well.
Yes,
Um,
yes, yes.
you know,
Well,
we,
right now it's a little problem because of the coronavirus, but
well, yeah.
yes, we have thousands of students. We have thousands of international students, yes.
And we should note for my American audience that Israel is one of the most diverse nations in the world in terms of ethnic and religious background and racial background. This is something that somehow is overlooked. Anyways, Eyal, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Would you like to let my listeners and viewers in on any particular websites that you maintain or articles that you've written?
Well, I publish on a weekly basis a piece in Israel Hayom.
Okay.
Yes, and it's being translated into English because I think that there is the English edition, and we have, the Tel Aviv University website. I'm with the Dayan Center. It's a research center for Middle Eastern studies. So my books, my articles are all there.
Wonderful. Eyal Zisser, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon. Thank you, sir.